Our sponsored Dakota Digital Academy to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you. My name is Patrick McCluskey. I'm the editor of Dakota Digital Review, and I got to know Jeremy because he's written an article. This is our third issue, and he wrote an article about the metaverse. Jeremy is the next speaker, and he's an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at NDSU, as well as the director of NDSU's Institute for Cybersecurity, Education, and Research. He's also a fellow at the Chali Institute at NDSU. His research spans a continuum from autonomous technology development to technology commercialization to asking questions of technology use, ethics, and national and international policy. Professor Straub has published more than 60 articles in academic journals and more than 100 peer-reviewed conference papers. He serves on multiple editorial boards and conference committees. Professor Straub is also the lead inventor on 2 U.S. patents and a member of multiple technical societies. And here he is, in person.
Well, thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Prakash, for inviting me to speak. So I think my presentation will kind of dovetail nicely with what we've just heard, because it builds on the concept of risk management as well here, and I'll give them a second to get the slides up before I start trying to advance them. That always seems to work well. But what I want to really talk about is kind of a broader aspect of risk management, a broader aspect of cybersecurity, right? We spend a lot of time talking about how to do this at the micro level, right? So we'll talk about specific tools, techniques, vulnerabilities, breaches, et cetera. Then we get into talking about how to manage this at the organizational level. Everything from best practices, cyber hygiene, to audit, which we just heard about. And one of the challenges, though, is a lot of times we have a risk that is extra-organizational from these types of potential calamities that could occur. And that's what I want to focus on today. So the presentation's title, Cybersecurity, Commercial Enterprise and National Security, and the subtitle, maybe the more interesting part, Managing Technology and Risk to Drive Prosperity and Economic Growth. So thinking about how do we bring these things together to actually make it so our society is secure as opposed to organization X or organization Y is secure, and thinking about how these pieces kind of dovetail together. So that's kind of the foundation upon which this builds. And the first thing I want everybody to think about for just a second here is how dependent we are on technology, right? This is not new, hopefully. But when you're thinking about risk management, when you're thinking about how do we protect things, how do we design things, how do we architect things, you have to think about all the different things and how these pieces interconnect. And in a lot of cases, very early in cybersecurity, where a lot of the problems came from is the connections, right? You would have systems that were at least somewhat secure on their own. Maybe they were never designed to be connected to anything, and that connection was actually, kind of opening the floodgate. Maybe they were somewhat secure, but system A had one vulnerability, system B had a second vulnerability, and when you put them together, again, there goes the floodgate. Well, all of these pieces of our society also kind of hook together in the same way, right? So if we have electronic banking and electronic dispatch of certain medicines, and we have electronic hotel reservations, and all of these businesses, all of these entities have little pieces of our information, maybe pieces of information that could be used to help help a nefarious person get into another one of these organizations. You can't really do an assessment unless you're thinking about how all these pieces fit together into kind of a grander whole. So the key concept here, I think, on this slide is that there's so many aspects where technology touches everybody every day, right? I mean, it would almost be easier to say, where doesn't technology touch everybody's everyday life? And for a lot of people, the answer is almost nowhere. You might be woken up in the morning by a Google Nest, a Google device, a Alexa device, et cetera. You might drive in a car that's connected to the internet or that's connected via your phone to the internet. You might then go to work where you work using the internet or something else. You go to order lunch. Probably at a minimum, you might be paying via a connected system. So again, if we start thinking about where are the vulnerabilities, where are the risks, what happens when these all go wrong, again, all of these little points along this continuum are things that we have to think about. And the real kind of big thing here, again, we could spend all day, we could spend all week, we could spend 5 years standing here listing off all the different systems we're dependent upon. If we tried to network how these systems connected to each other, we would need a much bigger room. We could write on every surface in here and we would not even scratch the surface of all of the different interconnections between all of the different systems that probably even a single individual is going to be relying upon in their daily life. So again, the problem is kind of extraordinary. But the real kind of kicker here is that society, human benefit, human progress, human prosperity is tied to the functioning of these systems. They're no longer ancillary. They're no longer things that help things work a little bit better maybe some of the time or augment an offline system. They are the system. And so that, again, is kind of part of the framework, the foundation upon which, again, we're continuing to think about this from a risk management perspective. Cybersecurity is just one part of this. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. That's obviously the theme of the conference here. But one of the other things that we have to think about is that there's lots of other types of risks. And I'll come back to this a little bit later on, but we have cybersecurity as a risk factor to other types of risks. We have other risks as a factor that comes into cybersecurity, and that's a whole nother area of possible consideration. And again, another whole thing to be thinking about when you're thinking about how all the pieces fit together and what your actual risk is and what your risk posture needs to be based upon that. So there's a few things here, of course, that we can think about on the slide. What does cybersecurity mean to these highly connected systems? Disabling, denying access to systems. So if we think about some of the systems on the previous slide, water, power, electric, banking, et cetera, denying access is pretty big, right? People can only survive for a certain amount of time without access to some of these systems. You need water pretty regularly, you need heat. Particularly in an area like North Dakota where it gets very cold in the winter, you need heat almost immediately. I've made this cold reference several times, and it's been pointed out to me that air conditioning is also very important in other areas of the world. We don't maybe think so much about that here. That's not necessarily a problem that we get into, but there are areas in the world where air conditioning is absolutely critical, particularly to members of vulnerable populations where they have a very limited amount of time that they can be in an unair-conditioned environment without a health impact. Air conditioning or refrigeration for food is really critical. So again, there's a long list. Denying access to these has a very tangible risk to it. Exactly what that risk is, how quickly that risk actualizes, and what the impact of it is, of course, depends on the specifics of it. Disabling and interfering with systems in times of key need. The system to run elections can work great 364 days of the year. If it doesn't work well on election day, you got a big problem, right? So there's a real incentive for adversaries that may have an interest in denying or disabling or interfering with a process to target that particular process at a time when we're hyper-reliant upon it. Again, depending on what the process is, depending on its implications, depending on the severity of what it causes, you're going to have different impact from that. We can also cause systems to maloperate, meaning operate in a way that is malicious and other than designed. So, for some systems, that might be a minor annoyance. If somebody hacked into our projection system here today, probably the biggest outcome of that would be interfering with these proceedings while it took a little bit of time to get that system back online. One thing that some people have done, which is very unfortunate and really questionable about why they decided to pick on particular people in this group, is they've actually tried to introduce flickering to cause epileptic seizures using a projection environment. That's a much bigger impact to a group of people that are particularly affected by it, and could be something that even in an environment like this, somebody might remotely hack in and interfere with the system. On the other end of the spectrum, interfering with the flight controls of an airplane or a UAV, interfering with a robot that's operating near people, these are things that for anybody that's nearby it, anybody that's on the ground in the path of where that airplane or UAV might come down, anybody that's by the robot that's working in a production environment might be injured by it or even killed by it quite quickly. So again, very different severity depending on exactly what goes wrong. We hear a lot about data capture and exfiltration and ransomware. I was at a presentation just a few days ago where they were talking about kind of what the big risk was on everybody's radar kind of across the cybersecurity landscape, and ransomware was the thing that came up the most for whatever reason. The impacts of this, again, really depend on what data is being stolen or denied access to, and in the case of ransomware, potentially whether you have a backup of it as well. The one point I would throw into this thing is data exfiltration isn't just identity theft. We think about it a lot that way. That's where a lot of cost comes from, right? But data exfiltration can also be a mechanism to attack another system. And so how many people heard of the Marriott breach? Anybody have familiarity with that? One or two people, all right. So the Marriott data breach is a few years back now, but it was a very large attack against Marriott hotel chain and got a ton of information from it. And the big thing, the reason that this attack is particularly interesting, it's not really because now, whoever the nefarious actor was knows where, the Smith family took their vacation 3 years ago. It was because the thought was because of the level of use of the Marriott hotels by the US federal government, that there might be some information that could be used to identify spies, right? Or people that are meeting with spies. You see somebody from government X and you see a US spy check in and check out of a hotel on about the same day. And a minimum, as a government that might be thinking they're being spied upon, you now have somebody to look into a lot more closely. So we don't really know exactly what the Marriott data has been used for, but there's a lot of thought that that might be one of the potential uses, and maybe it has been used in that way. But again, that's data exfiltration, not to try to, again, steal somebody's holiday pictures or something, but to try to actually attack a much bigger system, the national security apparatus, effectively through that. And again, there's lots of other stuff you can do with it. The Marriott data breach also lost a lot of passport information, which could be used as a credential to access other electronic systems as well. So a lot of different things that you have to think about. And of course, there's tons of other examples, right? This is just the tip of the iceberg. We could talk for weeks and weeks and weeks about this as well, but we won't because we don't have time. So the scary thing is, after all that was the preamble to the presentation. We're going to be here until 4 o'clock in the morning. Prakash, you have the room booked late right now. But in all seriousness, that really is where we're starting from. And where I want to think about going here is the risk management calculus as it relates to cybersecurity. And there's a lot there, right? We're thinking about threats to society broadly, and we're thinking about them in terms of threats to 4 areas. Which we'll get into in a second here: private enterprise, government, individuals, and academia. And we'll talk about how each of these are a little bit different and how they're the same and how these can be juxtaposed to some related areas as well. Obviously, there's some areas that don't fit nicely into those 4 categories, but I think those 4 categories give you an idea about how you could make a similar framework for other areas if you wanted to. And we'll talk a little bit about how you actually put these pieces together to look at how risk from components ties into a broader risk assessment for a region, for a government region, for society as large, even if you want to look at it on a worldwide basis. A lot of kind of interesting things to think about. So hopefully after the last slide, or the last presenter, I don't need to spend a whole lot of time on this slide. Risk management is a really important concept. There's 3 big areas of this, if you're not familiar with it: identifying risks, assessing risks, and preparing for risks. Identifying risks is an area that is absolutely critical. You can't deal with risks you haven't identified, right? There are things you can do broadly that may make you more resilient to certain types of risks, right? If we lock our doors, we prevent a lot of different nefarious types of individuals from possibly getting into our house. If we have good cyber hygiene, we prevent certain types of attacks across a spectrum. There are things that we can do that have global impact. But again, if we don't know what our risks are, we can't even really figure out how much of a risk we have of something, anything going wrong, much less dealing with them effectively and proactively. So identifying risks is really important. Assessing risks is also really important. Again, obviously, once we know what our risks are, once we figured out a list of them, we have to figure out how concerned we should be. And we'll talk about that for a second quickly as well. But the big questions here as part of our standard risk management framework: how likely is this to occur? What would be the impact if it did occur? Those 2 things together, if we have a good estimation of them, tell us an awful lot about a particular risk. And they allow us to do some math that comes back to the risk calculus that I was mentioning a minute ago. Finally, once we've figured out about how bad or good things are, the next question is, well, what do we do about it? So there's a lot of different things we can do to prepare for risks. I mean, the first thing we can do is we can simply say, hey, you know what, we're going to accept this risk. The risk that somebody might come running in here and yell something from the back of the room. Guess what? There's no guards over at that door. We've accepted the risk of a small disruption because the cost of having a guard stand there all day versus the likelihood and the impact of having somebody come in and have a disruption at that door is relatively low, and the cost of the guard is comparatively high. So we can accept a risk like that. You can accept lots of other risks. In some cases, you have no choice but to accept a risk. Risks can have no mechanism for mitigation. One of the things we talk about here is what happens if Old Faithful turns into a volcano again, right? There's nothing practically that most of us can do about that unless you happen to be on a flight that's taxiing down the runway at the time or really close to the airport. That's an unmitigatable risk. Similarly, there are risks that might be too expensive to mitigate because the cost to solve a problem is just high, or maybe there is no solution for the problem. There may be risks that are too expensive to mitigate compared to the likelihood of them happening and the cost of their mitigation. Because again, we have something that's a 1 in 100-year risk, very unlikely to happen, but the cost of it, over say maybe 10 years is more than the loss that would be incurred if that 1 in 100 instance happened. So again, we accept those risks. Those are not really the types of risks we're talking about today, but acceptance is an important concept to be aware of. In a lot of cases, what we're trying to do is either mitigate or prepare for risks or both. When we talk about mitigating, we're talking about doing something to make it less likely for the risk to occur or making it less severe of an instance if the risk does occur. When we're talking about response, we're talking about being prepared for it to occur, knowing what we're going to do next if that happens. So when we get into this concept of risk management, and again, we'll go through this kind of quickly because I know a lot of this was covered in the last presentation, we're talking about some key concepts. Coming back to risk identification, we need to understand the enterprise. This is a big area where risk management falls over. We need to understand the data, the processes, other factors, and what all of these systems, when they're working together, actually mean to the enterprise and beyond. A failure in any of these areas is probably going to lead to a lopsided risk management process. So again, very important to understand the enterprise, and this again does not necessarily mean commercial, right? This can be a government enterprise, this can be an academic enterprise, but whatever it is you're doing risk management for, you need to understand how the pieces work, what the pieces do, and what the implications of those pieces not doing that thing is for the particular enterprise, to understand where you may have points of failure, but to also understand what the risk factors and their impact is going to be. We also need to understand the risks, and this is another area where these processes frequently fall over. We need to identify, and we need to do a very frank job of identifying areas of risk and vulnerability. This does not just mean looking at known vulnerabilities for cyber systems, right? You may have heard the adage before, well, you can have a really great server, but what about the guy with the baseball bat, right? It doesn't matter how many software patches you put on the server if somebody can get at it and take a bat to it and break the system into 16 different pieces that you can't put back together. All of that is part of this assessment of risk. We want to look at the likelihood of the risks, like we talked about a second ago. We want to look at the impact if those risks eventuate. And that gives us a lot of the inputs that we need for this, which is the famous risk management equation. So this is, of course, nothing new, right? The risk equation is really simple. It's the likelihood of something bad happening multiplied by the impact if it does happen. So if we have a 10% chance of losing $10,000, our working number is $1,000, right? 10% times 10,000 gives us 1,000. Not everything can be thought of in strictly monetary terms. Some things you have numbers that dwarf other numbers, right? If you have something that's going to cause, the end of the planet, but it has a 0.001% chance of happening, that might still be a bigger number than a lot of your other areas. So this has to be done with some nuance. And again, the numbers sometimes can be a little bit misleading, particularly if they're guesstimates that you're trying to piece stuff back together about. When we have these numbers, though, there's a few different ways that they can be used. And one of them, of course, is just summing it, trying to understand what the overall risk to the organization is. So if you're an insurance company and you're trying to figure out what type of risk you're underwriting, the summing is a very important concept to you, right? This is telling you, well, if we're underwriting these 15 things that could go wrong, and we know that this one has this dollar cost potentially and this likelihood, and that one has this dollar cost and that likelihood. This is approximately what our policy is likely to cost us over a given period of time. We obviously want to charge the policyholder a little bit more than what we're likely to pay out. Now all of a sudden we figured out what it costs to have insurance. And I was actually participating in a panel with an actuarial institute a few days ago, which was really interesting about catastrophic risks. And we had some really great panelists on this. But one of the things that they mentioned that I thought was kind of a key takeaway from the panel is, when you're an insurance company, you're not so concerned about a single entity, right? I mean, obviously you don't want a big loss, so like the Marriott breach, obviously that's one very expensive entity. But what you're really concerned about is when you have a pattern between entities. When every hotel chain, and you write a lot of hotel policies, happens to have a similar risk factor, and they all happen to have an actualization at the same time. One of the things that came up repetitively during this discussion was the cloud. Because a lot of the companies that the various insurance agencies work with use basically one of 3 or 4 or 5 big web service providers. If one of those goes down, they have the potential of maybe having 25% of their policies go into loss right at the same time, which is far more than they're expecting, right? That's not the type of loss that they're set up for, nor is it a type of loss that they can really underwrite particularly well because the cost of the policy gets so high that nobody buys the insurance. So there's some really neat stuff to think about with risk calculus here. And again, summing is really valuable. From an institutional perspective, summing may be a really good number to help managers understand how big of an issue they may need to be dealing with. Being able to go into the boardroom and say, Mr. President, Mr. CEO, our annual cyber risk is $10 billion, right? That's powerful. If the people are still there and are not looking for other jobs at the end of that, depending on how big of the company it is, they may understand that there's a real problem that they need to deal with. But when you're actually dealing with the problem, prioritization or sorting can become the bigger thing, right? So when we sort, we take those numbers where we have, again, put the likelihood of occurrence together with the cost of occurrence, and then we simply say, if we think that these numbers are accurate, and they don't necessarily even have to be in dollars for this, right? Any unit of measurement that we can put everything into is fine. So we may have some stuff that doesn't come back to dollars really nicely, and we can come to something else, particularly if we don't want to, if there's certain things we don't want to be valuing in dollars, if in case the numbers ever got out. We sort it, and we now know where we should focus. If we can afford to do the top one, that maybe is our top priority. If we can afford to do the second one, maybe we go to that next. Now, of course, there may be some things that, even though they have a very high level of risk, there may be nothing we can do about it, or it's too expensive to do something about it. So we won't necessarily be able to do it in perfect order, but at least it tells us where to focus. It tells us where to start. It tells us where to go next after we finished one or decided we can't deal with one, or started the ball rolling on one and still have staff left to work on other stuff. This risk calculus is really highly reliant upon the underlying data. If you do the underlying data badly, this process is very, very useless, right? You may have a really good list of risks that can be valuable in and of itself. Your order may be wrong. Your understanding of the overall posture will probably be wrong. And your understanding of the actual risk to the enterprise probably will be wrong. So again, very important to do the best job possible on it. And we also want to be really concerned about systematic issues or bias, right? It's okay to make little mistakes on some of the components, particularly if they're mistakes that are kind of, random, right? Some things are a little bit more, some things are a little bit less. It may mess up our ordering a little bit, but if we're consistently under or over costing something, that's a problem. If we're looking at certain areas and we're under costing or over costing those areas, we may be looking at the wrong area of the enterprise. So systematic issues or bias are really important to understand because it makes a much bigger problem with the analysis than a single mess up in one area, or again, a little bit of, these are guesstimates, fine, there's gonna be some error in them, that again, some are higher, some are lower over the whole thing. Now that's where, in a lot of cases, the process stops, right? That's all pretty typical. The question now is, okay, what about the cost beyond the enterprise, right? So if we had a failure, say, of the power company in the Grand Forks area, the cost to the power company might be relatively low, right? They might lose a little bit of revenue. They're probably protected by statute from a lot of types of claims that other types of entities might have. That's pretty typical for certain types of utilities. but the actual cost to society is going to be quite large. So many enterprises have an impact of risk occurrence, that's much bigger than the enterprise itself, right? So of course, if we know the power goes out in Grand Forks and it's the middle of winter, we're going to have a lot of cold people, right? Even if you have natural gas heating, you probably have an electric blower that you need to work with that. We're going to have perhaps food spoilage, unless it is the winter and then you can put the food outside. We'll have other issues like lost productivity. The airport might have to shut down if it doesn't have its own generators, which probably it does. But there's a lot of follow-on things that can happen in society that actually make the cost to society of certain risks eventuating much higher than you would calculate if you were doing it just for the enterprise itself. So again, we can see here a variety of different things on the slide, individuals' daily lives, denying access to critical services, and of course these critical services are where we get into the costs that may include human fatalities as well, losing heat in the winter, et cetera. So there's a significant amount of consideration that needs to be paid to risk beyond the enterprise itself. It's a critical area of assessment. Also, we need businesses to think about this risk when they're designing their risk management plans, right? This is a big thing. If the business is only designing a plan for itself and it's providing critical services, guess what? That risk management plan, it may be great for the business, but it's not doing everything that it may need to do for society. If the business isn't going to do that, or the academic institution or government or whatever isn't going to do that, that's an area where they may need broader help. That's an area where government may have a role, or somebody else may have a role in the public sector to step in and actually help understand and underwrite this extra enterprise risk cost. One area that I think we are not giving nearly enough attention to is the failure of small businesses after cyber attacks. Because practically, if I'm a small business and I have lots and lots of data, which a lot of small businesses do, an attack that is even mildly successful might be a catastrophic event for the enterprise, right? If I'm a mom and pop business and I now have 10,000 people that all even just need free credit monitoring for a few years, that might be enough to close the business, right? And so if I start with that, if I can't get a ton of insurance, or I can't afford a ton of insurance, and I start with this idea, well, this breach is, I close the door, I flip the sign to close, I go home and, wait for nasty letters to show up in the mail. That's a real problem, right? That's a real area where the societal risk is not being managed because the enterprise has determined that the risk is kind of beyond its capability and even really beyond its need to manage. And so there's, again, a lot of areas like that where we have to think about risk beyond the particular type of enterprise. Another area where we see a certain amount of failure on some of these plans, particularly under times of stress, is the assumption that enterprises are going to get aid in responding. So a lot of people assume that when something goes wrong, when they're breached, somebody else is going to come in and help plan this or run this incident response, right? That's something the FBI does, or DHS, or NSA, or somebody. And the reality is there are certain incidents, if it turns out that, you've compromised the nuclear launch codes, you're going to get a few federal agencies, maybe not so much offering to help, but showing up to help you, really whether you want the assistance or not. But if you're a small business, if you're an enterprise that doesn't have a national security implication, you may not get a ton of aid from other places if they have a ton of other things that they need to be working on, right? They have to prioritize their limited resources for response based upon, the types of things that they're seeing at the moment, the likelihood of actually catching a perpetrator and bringing them to justice, what the impact, again, to broader society is from the particular incident. So enterprises that are assuming that they're going to get a ton of help from somebody else are probably maybe not probably, but may have a likelihood of that not being a viable part of their response strategy, which can be problematic. Again, not just federal agencies, a lot of enterprises hope that they're going to get help from state and local officials. The ability of states and local governments to actually help in these things is really varied. North Dakota, fortunately, has invested a lot in cyber response capabilities at the state level. But if you think about some of the smaller town police departments or sheriff's offices, they're not going to have a whole lot of response capability to come in and help. They just don't have the staff with the training to do it. So again, that capability may be very limited. A lot of companies also think that they may get help from their insurance company. And this can be another little bit of a problem as well. And insurance company provided resources are something you're basically paying for with the policy, right? That's something that's part of your contract, and you obviously should be assuming that you're going to get something if you're paying for it. Where sometimes this falls over is that if the insurer can determine quite rapidly that this isn't a covered event, that coverage may go away quite rapidly, right? So some insurance companies will send initial response before they understand whether they're actually on the hook for it. In fact, that might be in the policy language, is that they will provide a initial response capability to any type of cyber incident. What we've seen recently is that some types of cyber incidents, even though they occurred against private entities, have been determined to fall outside of cyber policies. Cyber policies have gotten really expensive for insurance companies as the level of losses on them have gone up. And so a variety of different attacks recently have been categorized by insurance companies as things like acts of war or other things that are disclaimed in policy language. And as soon as you hit one of those disclaimers, best case scenario, you're probably suing the insurance company to try to get coverage. It also means that they're not paying for it up front. So if you're assuming that the insurance company is going to be providing the resources and paying for the resources, and it turns out that it's the type of incident you've had is not covered by your policy, you may be in for a very big surprise very quickly there. The last notion is that a lot of people assume that they're going to be able to hire somebody to come in and fix the problem on demand. That they won't spend the money now, but they realize it'll be kind of expensive later on. And this is another area where if you get lucky, maybe you'll find somebody. If you don't, you have nobody that has a commitment to you, so you may find that you're not actually hiring somebody on demand because there's just simply nobody available to hire. So this can be another area where some of these assumptions about response fall over as well. And so having layered another level of kind of foundation on this, I want to now start thinking a little bit more about the particular types of enterprises that we might be actually dealing with here, right? So again, we said we're going to look at four. We said we're going to look at private enterprise, government, academia, and I forgot one. The slides will remind me. I don't remember what the last one is. So private enterprise is really simple, right? This is businesses of all size. The thing that I would also throw into this is things like revenue-based nonprofits, social enterprises, et cetera, where they are reliant upon people buying a good or service as part of their ongoing operations. They're not getting, not, for example, just relying upon donations. They're not getting money from taxpayers. They're actually selling a good or service. I would put those into this as well. And there's a variety of things that kind of come into play here. The biggest thing, though, is that they need to keep producing revenue, right? Most businesses cannot exist for a significant period of time if they are not actually engaged in their current line of business. For some businesses, this is a lot longer than others. We saw this during the pandemic, right? When everybody closed down, some businesses were able to keep operating, keep paying people, put people on leave, et cetera. Other businesses went out of business quite quickly. But the reality is, of course, our mitigation approach, our response approach has to be focused for a private enterprise on restoring that enterprise back to operations, because if you don't do that fast enough, there isn't going to be an enterprise anymore. So that's a really big thing. We also need to think about the continuity of operations and support of customers. So this is a kind of a basket that includes a ton of different things, right? What is it that your customers expect of your business every day? What does that mean to them? This is an area where we get into these broader than organizational risks, right? If you're providing security services and your IT goes down and you no longer know where you're supposed to send your security guards to, your problem may be that you're not getting revenue from billing out these security guards, and maybe you're having to pay them. You may have a little bit of liability if you're contractually required to have those security guards there and you don't, but for the entities that are supposed to be getting the security, their risk is now they don't have anybody securing their premises or whatever it is that's supposed to be secured. And again, so that continuity of operations and support of customers is a big one. Goodwill and trust in business is another big one, right? Even if you can continue to operate, if nobody wants to buy a product or service from you anymore, you're really not in business, right? Even though you could sell stuff, you don't actually make those sales because there's nobody to buy it. So making customers feel like you're responding well, that they would feel, maybe not immediately, but at least down the road, comfortable buying stuff from you, again, is another really big, important area. Finally, you may find that there's a financial impact from this operational impact. Obviously, if you don't have revenue, you're losing money, but you may also not have the ability to borrow, right? Trying to go get a loan from a bank right after you've been hacked and you have no current revenue, nobody can really figure out if you're going to have revenue again in the future. most banks don't look at that as a favorable lending condition. So you may have a cash flow problem that comes from that as well. So again, there's a lot of different things to think about there. Some of these are unique to the private enterprise. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we start juxtaposing some of these. Some of these are not. There's a variety of risk areas. We've talked about liability for interrupter operations already. Even though your business has been attacked, you may still have compliance obligations, right? You may still have non-disclosure agreements. You may still have export controls. You may still have other things that your business needs to do to be compliant with laws that need to be done, even though it's not business operating as normal, and there may be fines and fees and other penalties for not doing it. You may have liability for lost or stolen data. I think at this point, we probably all kind of know what that cost is. That's something we hear a lot about, but that's another one that needs to be considered. So we'll turn our focus now over to government. Obviously, government are entities that operate by virtue of a statutory authority. This includes two types of entities, right? So, when you think government, a lot of, the first thing is you probably will think, well, government doesn't really need to keep its customers happy, right? Everybody's already its customer. You can't really say, I don't want to deal with this government anymore. But that's not entirely true, right? There are agencies that provide services that you only pay for if you use, right? If the park services, for example, don't have people going to them, they lose a lot of money from admissions fees, parking, et cetera. So there is there's two types of government agencies here, those that people basically have to keep dealing with unless they're going to move or something, and then the agencies where they actually really are more like a business and that they need customers or people to use their service or do whatever in order to actually have revenue. Again, the exact risk factors for them differ a little bit based upon what category they fall into. What government has that enterprises perhaps don't is a much stronger mechanism for the public to provide feedback on and demand changes to their operations. So again, businesses have to keep their customers happy, they have to keep their shareholders happy, governments have to really kind of keep everybody happy. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, goodwill and reputation are still very important here as well. The need to maintain critical services, obviously, municipal governments, state governments, federal governments, there are some things that they do that do not have to be done every day. And again, if we have to close the national parks for a little bit of time, it's not great. There are some roadways that are impacted, as we saw during the pandemic, and a lot of other follow-on impacts. But it's a very different than if we have to say close down the FAA for a few days. Now we no longer have a national air transportation network. So when you're thinking about government, you also have to think about these key services that the government has to keep providing, really, ideally no matter what, right? They should be resilient against pretty much everything, or at least against all but the most extreme things. And then also the last point on the top area, the need to actually provide services to others during a crisis. And so one of the areas when you get into risk management on a wider than enterprise scale that you need to think about is what about when everybody in the same area, whether it's a sector or a geographic area, has a problem at the same time, right? So if, for example, a municipality floods, you have the government who's impacted because their buildings are all flooded, but they also have to help everybody whose house and whose business has been flooded because they provide those services. We can have a similar concept in cyber, right? If the regulator for a particular industry is having a cyber attack and the industry has also been attacked, you have, again, two parties that might have a role in helping each other, now both being impacted at the same time by the issue. So that's another thing that comes into this, not just with government, but it's a pretty critical consideration when you're thinking about governments. Again, we still have compliance issues as a thing to think about when we're thinking about government. We have potential revenue impact for certain types of government entities that are selling services. We may have a revenue impact for government entities that people have to deal with if people can't deal with them, right? Nobody can go into the DMV and pay to renew their driver's license if the DMV can't operate, so it's losing revenue there. It may get most of that back because the demand will pent up in a way that the demand for a hotel, for example, wouldn't. But certainly there is an impediment to those revenues from that at the time of the crisis. Finally, you may have liability to constituents, suppliers, and other parties who the government may have either a statutory responsibility to or a contractual responsibility to that need to be considered as well. Academia is our next area. Again, we'll go through this a little bit more quickly because it actually brings up some of the things that we've already talked about from several of the other ones. One of the big things in academia is the residential campus, right? If an institution has a crisis, it really can't just close, right? I mean, if you have a problem with a bank branch, if you have a problem with a particular restaurant, you can say, hey, you know, we're going to shut down for a few days, particularly if it's only one location or only one, company. That may not be, that catastrophic. A residential campus, though, you still have people there that need to do something, right? They still need potentially to be fed, they need to be housed, they need power, water, et cetera. So these things have to be thought of as well when you're coming up with your framework. The other aspect of this is the potential that these institutions may have a role in a broader response. And again, that kind of depends on the institution. But we see a lot of times that academic institutions may, at a minimum, be providing a facility response for things, right? So if there's a problem in an area, if there's a hurricane, if there's a flood, a lot of cases, the places that become the shelters are places like high schools or middle schools or elementary schools or college campuses. Again, if there's something that requires that type of response, let's assume the local utility gets knocked out for an area, where are you going to shelter people? Well, that might be a role that falls upon an academic institution, depending on how the emergency response plan for a particular region is designed. So that's something else that needs to be kept in mind. Again, we have our goodwill and trust considerations, and of course the fact that if the academic enterprise is not engaged in its primary line of business, it may be losing financial resources by virtue of that. The last one that I couldn't remember because it wasn't an entity type, so I got my 3 entity types, but I couldn't think of what the 4th thing was, is individuals. And individuals are another area where we don't hear a whole lot about this, right? Most individuals do not have a cyber attack emergency response plan. If you have one, congratulations. If you don't, you probably don't need to go home this evening and make one unless you're in a very unique situation. However, individuals have a lot of potential to be impacted by and a big role in responding to these impacts. And because of this, they need to be considered when we start getting into bringing these pieces all together. So when we're talking about people acting in a personal capacity as individuals, we need to think about things like their immediate needs, food, water, shelter, et cetera. We need to think about mid-range needs, such as the needed services that may not be quite as immediate, restoring normal routines, maintaining their morale, et cetera. And then we need to think about long-term impacts, such as what the incident may have done to their reputation, to their career, housing, other longer-term service needs. And the thing when we're thinking about individuals is that we have these time frames that are pretty specific, right? People need certain services quite quickly after an incident, right? Again, we have something that knocks out power to an area while it's very cold or very hot. We have a very limited window to come up with a substitute for that service. We have a little bit longer if that affects food and water, but that's again a very limited window. For some of these, we rely upon people having a certain amount of personal resilience, right? We hope that most people have a certain amount of food and water in their house so that if McDonald's closes down for a day because of something, we don't have a portion of society that has an immediate need. That's not always a valid assumption. And if we think about academic campuses where students may be planning to go to a dining center, that may be an assumption that fails almost immediately. But again, we know that there's a time frame there, and that's something that has to come into the consideration. We also know that there are impacts from even incidents that are properly responded to, where you have a best case response that can have a long-term implication as well. That's something else that needs to be considered. Another big one is the duality of role of the individual, right? And not only are they having this personal incident that they're having to deal with, but they're also responding potentially on an organizational level as well. So again, I'll keep using the non-really cyber-related example of a flood, but a lot of the people that respond to floods are also people whose houses or apartments or whatever have been flooded as well. Cyber incidents may have a parallel to this. It may not be a geographic connection. It may be a particular group that's targeted. It may be people in a particular industry. It may be that people that work at a bank are also customers of a bank. People that work at a hospital are also relying upon medical services from that hospital, where they have a duality between their institutional role of response and their personal need to respond to their personal situation as well. And again, we have to think about long-term aspects in the short term as well, because we can mitigate some of the long-term impacts if we do that, if we think about them quickly enough. So that's where now that we've looked at the different areas, we can start kind of thinking about bringing them together. We come back again to our risk assessment. looking at the risks, the risk impact, the risk likelihood, thinking about how do we prepare for and respond to these things. And the big thing to keep in mind here is that our basic calculus of risk doesn't change. What does is the impact that we're thinking about response plans that are extra-organizational, also thinking about how response plans from different organizations within a region, within a sector, within a group that might be co-targeted for some reason, can dovetail together, and looking at how there's resilience or a lack of said, depending on what's targeted. One of the things that, of course, you mentioned a few minutes ago was, if all your suppliers are, have problems at the same time, adding those up, right? And that's in a lot of cases, something that's not done in risk management plans. That's a very advanced concept. A lot of people assume that they're going to get their SLA, which is service level agreement, from the next supplier up the chain, and they don't bother to see whether that's actually a reasonable assumption or not. When we're talking about looking at extra organizational risk, what about a situation where it's not just what our suppliers can do on a good day? What about when our supplier no longer has a premises, or our supplier no longer has electricity because they're located close enough to us that the attack against the power plant actually affected them as well? A lot of our response plans, necessarily, even organizational response plans, necessarily have to be different under these circumstances. So this is another really big thing to consider. So we're thinking broader impact, but we're also thinking about how all of these pieces hook together. And again, some of this ties into our local plan, some of it is looked at organizationally, but we also need to think about making plans at a broader than organizational level. There's a few things that as we start doing that, we have to start breaking away from, right? We can't assume that individuals have plans, right? Very few people probably have cyber incident response plans. We know, because FEMA and others have done studies on this, that very few people actually have emergency response plans at all, right? Every time we have some sort of emergency coming up in a particular area, we see people rapidly rush to come up with these plans, which normally involves trying to buy up all of the water and other products that are available that they need, because they don't have them. Their emergency response plan is, well, if something looks like it's going to go wrong, I'm going to figure out how to deal with it then. When we get into things that are further removed from daily life, like cyber incidents, even fewer people have response plans. A lot of people don't even understand what they would need to think about in order to make a response plan. So we really can't assume that individuals have response plans, and plans that exist may be poorly thought out, they might be out of date, they might be scope limited, they may not be very good. So we have to kind of assume that if we're doing risk management on a societal basis, we have to kind of plan for the individuals, because we can't assume that they're doing it for themselves. We also have to think a lot about organizational plans, right? We can't assume that organizational plans can simply be locked in like two bricks of Lego being hooked together, as nice as it would be to be able to plan that way. They may be poorly designed, they may be poorly implemented, they may not have enough detail, they might have too much detail, they may have a lack of consideration beyond the organization, which is a big thing. They may be out of date, they may have estimation issues, right? We talked about a lot of these things already as we were going through the different areas of focus. We also have to think about the fact that organizations might fail in crisis and then just simply not act on plans, right? A business that realizes it's going out of business typically does not act in the same way that they would if they think they're going to be operating as an ongoing concern. They may take some response steps, but they may not be the response steps that you would think or plan on them taking. We also have to assume that there are organizations out there that may not have plans, and I guess probably something else I should have put on dovetailing with that point is that there are organizations out there that we may not know about in thinking about how the societal plan all comes together. So when we're thinking about societal risk assessment, when we're thinking about building a framework like this, we're thinking about bringing together a lot of different people's plans. We're thinking about bringing in factors that are not considered on these individual plans. We're thinking about issues with the reliability. We're thinking about issues with the firm's reliability. And then we're trying to figure out where to devote societal resources to improving mitigation, response, maybe helping with planning, because again, there's a limited amount of that as well. So we're bringing all of these pieces together to basically do something that's not that dissimilar to the organizational cyber incident response process at a societal level. In some cases, this can be useful to understand, even if there's not a whole lot you can do, because it helps to understand the type of environment you might be operating in if you were to reach this type of incident environment. Once we have some sort of a plan, we can assess it for weaknesses, we can look for systematic weaknesses, and we can look for areas where a single incident or a single type of incident might cause a disproportionate impact in a way that lots of individual plans don't address and really probably couldn't address because they wouldn't be aware of it. So that's where this kind of ends up at the moment. Again, thanks everybody for listening to this for a little bit. I hope this has been useful. We're still working on developing a broader framework for this with a lot more nuance. Prakash has given me the sign here, so I would say I could go on longer, but apparently I can't. So we'll certainly, I think, probably have a minute for a few questions. Yeah, but certainly, it's important to realize that a lot of these concepts are not new. In fact, there's a lot of literature out here in this space already, in the risk management literature, in the emergency management literature that we're building upon. We also have to consider that incidents are broader than cybersecurity risks. I've used a variety of kind of unrelated issues today that are a little bit easier to conceptualize. These issues and others like them will have related cyber risks, right? When a city floods, it damages IT. You may also have IT as part of an incident where a flood, a fire, et cetera, starts from an IT breach. And that's something else where you have to kind of think about how these two systems, how these two areas to think about all kind of fit together. And probably the biggest takeaway is that these concepts right now can be used by organizations. This is not something where you have to wait until we get this framework all the way done. Really, the pieces can be brought together at the local level, at the regional level, and beyond, and that's already possible right now. And of course, the growing reliance on electronic systems makes it so we have to think about this now, right? We're actually already way behind in terms of thinking about this type of stuff. So with that, if it lets me, oh, there we go. So that's it. Any questions? Yes. So I guess in terms of, so did you say, sorry, utility cyber insurance, or I couldn't hear quite what you said. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, so when you're thinking about operational technology, I think there are two parts to that that really kind of are perhaps where the challenge exists. So one of the things that we talked about, I mentioned I was involved in a cyber risk panel from an insurance perspective a few days ago. There was a discussion of how fire risk is kind of a unique risk, even when it relates to cyber insurance, because it's very difficult to exclude fire coverage from a policy, even if it comes from something else. So I think there are areas of kind of the operational technology space where you would find it to be very difficult to exclude that type of coverage. But I think the other aspect of it is that if you have a policy that's written in a certain way that kind of scopes out cyber, and you have, that's the entrance point, you get into some very fine, detailed calculations about what the policy language actually says in terms of whether you're actually covered or not. And I guess, if I were buying insurance or if I were selling insurance in that space, I would be looking at those details a lot, because it really, you can't really assume that you have a broad spectrum, a broad umbrella of insurance in the cyberspace now, because insurance companies are really trying to limit their exposure because they've taken such a hit there. So, and I guess I would not even necessarily assume that aside from trying to limit their exposure, there are necessarily trends all the way across the industry now. I think a lot of companies may be responding to things that they've specifically seen themselves. I know there's been some discussion of Lloyd's of London, who's a really big insurer and reinsurer, actually saying, we just don't want the cyber risk, send people elsewhere with it, and telling what they call their syndicators, the people that actually write the policies, to not write certain types of policies, as I understand it, or to at least not include that type of coverage in it, because they didn't feel like it's a risk that really works well with the type of modeling that they have at the moment. And again, I don't fully understand the Lloyd's announcement, nor have I been privy to any particular information about it. But those are the types of things that I guess I would think about in that realm. And I think it's a really interesting area, and certainly, OT is a really big thing, right? It's a lot of pieces of society and a lot of potential for risk as well, and for liability. So that's a really neat question. Sorry? Yeah. And so that's a good point. I'll just repeat that. He said that Lloyd's dropped many nation, or I guess some subset at least of nation state risk as well because of some of the things that we've seen recently, I would assume, with some of the geopolitics. So again, really good point. Thanks for that. Any other questions? Yes.
So, in systems that have a lot of dynamically changes over time, there's a whole world of modeling of what's gone on dynamically, time series analysis, all kinds of methods for modeling methodologies. And then often the idea that these trends and these changes in the past can be used to in some way forecast what's going to go on in the future. But I'm just wondering what you think about, this sort of viewpoint on things as it applies to, cyber incidents, cyber threats, risks that are cyber in nature in the world that we live in with cyber threats and risks. Is there traction for this sort of view, or is that kind of
Well, I think that's another interesting question. I'll just repeat it for everybody in case you couldn't hear it. So the basic gist of the question was, we learn a lot from what's happened in the past, right? We look at incidents and we try to learn from them, we try to improve from them, and can we really do that with a cyber incident? And I think there's a yes and a no to that. I mean, I think certainly if you don't learn from past incidents, if you don't learn from the body of knowledge out there, you're maybe not guaranteed, but you're certainly increasing your likelihood of repeating that, right? So I think there's a lot that we can take away from the problems that have already been solved, the solutions that have been implemented. Certainly, if you're not using the patches that have been developed in response to previous incidents, you're not even really starting at the starting line when you're running the race against the adversary to try to prevent future incidents. But on the other end of the spectrum, we can't necessarily make assumptions about where the next cyber attack is going to come from, other than perhaps to assume that it could come from anywhere. And I think that's the area where past experience can actually be quite harmful, because you can end up in a scenario where you're fighting the last war, and we have a big cyber incident over there, so everybody gets concerned about this. We get really good at mitigating this particular type of issue, or responding to this particular type of issue. And it's interesting because we see this a lot in the emergency management discipline, right? A region has a fire, they have a flood, and they will do a ton to respond to that type of incident, right? They have a flood, so they build all of the things you need to respond to floods, right? This region has got a lot of flood protection because there was a flood incident in it. However, unless that is a cyclical type of incident, that may not be exactly what you need, right? So we know, for example, the Red River tries to flood every year, right? It goes up, a certain level as the ice melts, and so we need a certain level of flood protection, and so that's a cyclical incident. But if you have somebody that attacks your email system, for example, and you decide to have the most robust email system in the history of the planet, and you decide not to secure, say your Active Directory system at all, you've now created a massive disproportionality between the systems, and a halfway intelligent attacker, once they realize what you've done, is going to just stop targeting the system that you've just you've actually secured, and just simply try to target another system that may not be as secure. So I think in that regard, the past can actually be somewhat harmful unless you use it to kind of take away the message that we should be prepared, hopefully, for anywhere, everywhere. Think in terms of risk analysis as opposed to again trying to fight the last war. But great question, thanks, Ken.
Thank you, Dr. Straub, for your insight on for this emergency management, how cybersecurity implications. So let's thank the speaker for his time. And I'm going to ask Dakota Digital Academy to honor Dr. Jeremy Straub with a nice plaque. And I know that pizza is ready. Just be patient for a few more minutes. We have some other awards that we probably want to give.
Okay. We have here the plaque for Dr. Straub.
Next,